Welcome everyone to our webinar, Tips on Writing a Competitive EPA Job Training, I should say application. That's what we call them these days. Next slide.
Okay, hold on here.
Waiting for the next slide.
There we go.
Thank you. So yeah, the purpose of our webinar today is to present tips and strategies for submitting a competitive FY25 Brownfields Job Training Grant application to fund local environmental workforce training in support of assessment, cleanup, and sustainable reuse of brownfields in your community. Next slide. Just a few technical notes. If you could jot down the phone number and email of Tim Hunter, who's on the back end of things running the technology. He can help if there's any issues you encounter. I'd also like to mention that the presentation slides and a companion technical document and a bunch of other resources are posted or will be a link will be put in the chat box to where you can go to find those materials. So yeah, Tim, if you want to put those links in. Next slide. Just a few basics. Please do keep yourself muted and your video off, and open your participants box and rename yourself to include your affiliation so we can see. It's just interesting to see who all has joined, if you don't mind doing that. Please also open your chat box, your chat feature. You can ask any questions you'd like during the program by sending a chat to everyone, and we'll be addressing those as we go and also at the end. Next slide. Okay, the agenda. Would recommend you'll get a link to the agenda soon in the chat, and if you would like to open a more detailed version of the agenda, that might help you keep track of where we are in the program, because as usual, there will be a lot of information. So thanks, Tim, for sending that. Basically, I'll start with an introduction, and Steve Fenton will talk about pre-submission tips. So before you even start writing, some of the homework you need to do in preparing for this to submit an application. Nolan Curtis will talk about writing the application itself. And then Steve will come back, tell us a little bit more about some things to do right before you submit the application. Mike Senu will talk then about kind of things to avoid based on lessons learned from previous proposal efforts we've known about and been involved in coaching communities on. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with the Q&A and some summary points and information about resources. And importantly, we'll give you the opportunity to complete an evaluation that would be very useful to us in learning if we hit the mark or what we could do in the future to do a better job. So please give some attention to that. We'd really appreciate it. Next slide. Okay, so by way of introduction, the funding you'll be applying for is to recruit and provide workforce training to residents of solid and hazardous waste impacted communities with skills needed to assess, clean up, and prepare contaminated sites, including brownfields, for sustainable reuse as part of community-led revitalization efforts. Next slide. Just in review, brownfields are environmentally distressed properties that communities identify for a new use after some environmental assessment and perhaps cleanup is done on it. So taking a site that looks like the one on the left, an old boiler plant with USTs and other environmental concerns, getting those concerns addressed and converted into something like a temporary housing facility for homeless children on the right. That's a real life story in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it's it's the environmental technicians that assist with assessment and cleanup of these sites and also other aspects of things that are a foundational focus of EPA job training programs. Next slide. And so the environmental training and certifications are particularly valuable when thinking about, writing proposals and things like that to urban, rural, and tribal communities that have funding to address those brownfields. So some of the assessment and cleanup dollars are ways to get it to deal with those brownfields in their sites. Communities with unemployed or underemployed populations, which is a focus of job training programs. Compelling environmental justice and other needs. So, in the lower two images on the left, not only in big urban areas, but in rural areas or with tribes, these are areas that, need a workforce to do this work. Communities with existing workforce programs that maybe just need to fill gaps in environmental health and safety training and other types of training listed on the slide. And communities with revitalization needs involving green infrastructure and renewable energy efficiency, and other sustainable beneficial uses, which there's plenty of funding out there right now to do, and dovetails nicely with these types of grants that can provide, the workforce that's needed. Next slide. Okay, so some basics about the job training applications. You can apply for up to $500,000 to be expended over 5 years. The due date is August 15th, coming up in a couple of months. And the application consists of a number of sections listed on the slide. I'll be highlighting the narrative information sheet, the narrative itself, which is a scored part of the proposal that you can earn up to 200 total points on, some attachments that supplement the narrative, and then a threshold criteria section that's pass or fail. So kind of to make sure you pass, it's always good. Maybe the first thing you do is to make sure you can meet those threshold criteria. And that has a lot to do with eligibility, and EPA can help on that if you have questions. That's one thing they can do. They can't answer a lot of questions about strategy and things like that, but they can help you determine if you're really eligible to apply for this if you have questions. Because there isn't a lot of time to respond to this, it's good to kind of get going on doing your homework, which you'll hear a lot about actually in this webinar, and to start writing soon, and to request review of your draft application from TAB or other folks, other sets of eyes that can proofread what you've written. And these applications are submitted through grants.gov, and that's can be a tricky task. So it's good to make sure your organization is fully set up to do that. It can take a couple to several weeks to really be fully set up to do that if you're not already. So please give that attention. And it's also good to submit your applications several days early if possible to make sure it really gets through the grant.gov's steps. Next slide. Okay, so the narrative section is where you tell your story, and competing well in kind of this application process really depends on you telling your story well, fully communicating your story, because every community's story is different. It's compelling, and you need to make sure it gets down on paper that way and understood that way. So kind of before getting into the details of that, if you look at the left side of the slide, it's really good to keep in mind some real kind of general universal good writing practices. So part of that is developing your storyline. What's your story? And that, in terms of these proposals, many times is pretty much articulating your problem. We have brownfields. we need a workforce to clean them up. If you give us funding, this is how we're going to do that. And then here's what we expect the results will be. So to develop that sort of almost an elevator speech understanding of what that is. And then it's good to reiterate that over and over again throughout the story. You know, that's that story through line, they call it, so that from the very beginning of your narrative section, you articulate that in a very kind of an overview, one paragraph type thing. And then in the body of the report, you really go through the details of what your plan is. And then towards the end of the application, you give that overview again and reiterate things. So you reiterate your storyline. And the way the proposals or the scored sections of the proposal or the application is set up, it's somewhat easy to do that. It's very easy to initially say what your story is, your problem, your plan, and expected results a little bit in the community needs section. And if you look at the points allocations for that, and then also you see that program structure, outputs and outcomes. Outputs and outcomes are the expected results, basically. So you can kind of see that about half of the 200 points, EPA is prioritizing towards your need and your expected outcomes, those parts of the story. The other half is your plan. So that's the training program description, the budget, your partners, the leveraged effort, programmatic capability, experience type things doing that. I'd like to suggest also that it's very important to look at the application guidelines, the link of which was, I think, in the previous slide. So be sure to get a copy of those. And they tell you exactly what to write or what to write to get the most points here. Next slide. So there's also, of course, a narrative sheet that goes before the narrative. That it's sort of like a cover sheet. It's up to 3 pages long. It includes a lot of information, but some of what's included are called other factors, which are and I think you could probably put additional considerations discussed in the application guidelines, and those are important for final selection determination. Say if there's tiebreakers, or if EPA is trying to give special preference in the fairest way to tribes, very small communities, and some other communities meeting other criteria. And this is kind of at a glance where that information shows up. So it's important to get that right. It's important to have the narrative attachments like partnership letters that support your narrative section that impacts the scores you're going to be getting. And again, it's important to meet the threshold criteria and demonstrate you meet it so that you can receive passing status on those things. And you can just kind of read a short list of what those are. It's not a complete list, but giving you, giving you a feel for what you need to do. And it's something I'll say is it's important to respond to each one of those items. Don't skip something because it doesn't seem to apply to you. If it doesn't apply to you, you say so, you write it out, you say why it doesn't apply, but don't skip items because that could disqualify you because you didn't respond to an item. So super important. Going to the left side of the slide, back to the universal good writing things. Another way to think about storytelling is articulating the what, the why, and the who. And what I would like to say is EPA and this kind of work, right, with environmental justice, underemployed folks, revitalization, has a lot to do with the who. So it's very important, whether it's who the community is, who the local workforce folks you want to train is, who's executing the work, or the experience, that kind of thing, and certainly who benefits. So because I know all of you on here care about that. It's just easy sometimes to get lost in the shuffle when you've got all these specific little items to respond to in an application format. So please try to keep that in mind. Some other considerations in the application guidelines. There are a number of suggested sample tables to use, like when you're describing demographics information and describing your community or describing your training program. Please, consider using those formats because EPA is familiar with those. They are pretty good ways to articulate, what you mean in a table form on certain things. Certainly the budget format, that's a good one to use. So consider using those. It doesn't mean you can't use other tables or more tables. Also, when you read the guidelines, you'll see some bolded text and italics text. Make sure you pay attention to those. Sometimes that they're emphasizing things that are important for you to remember. I don't know if 12-point font is one of them, but that's an example of a format requirement that's just important for you to know and could cause a big problem if you didn't notice that. So at any rate, next slide. Okay, and lastly, just in the introduction here, encourage you to reach out to your technical assistance to brownfields providers. Links are on this slide, and again, you can download the slides, get to the links. Individuals you can talk to in each one of these places on job training topics, including applications, is at the end of this webinar. You'll see the slides for that. You can request, again, review of your draft applications in advance of submitting them. So we encourage you to take advantage of that. I'd also like to say on our webpage, we've got, and at the link on this slide, we've got four successful past applications, maybe a couple years old, that you can look at, you can download, get a sense for what's been selected for funding in the past. Encourage you to do that. Next slide. So at this point, I'll turn things over to our experts, Michael Senu, Nolan Curtis, and Steve Fenton. You can read more about their qualifications in the companion document. What I'll say is they're probably, especially when you put all three of them together, they're probably the most knowledgeable three people there are in job training program topics. And so without further ado, I'll hand it off to Nolan, I think, to take us into the program.
Thank you, Blaise, for that overview and introduction. Next slide, please. So we will be asking a few poll questions throughout the webinar to help us gain a better understanding of who you are. Tim, do you want to put up the questions? So please take a minute to respond to the questions on your screen. You may check all of the boxes that may apply. For example, if you're rural and tribal. And in a minute or two, we'll have the results. So if you please do that now. Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for playing. I think we have a pretty good idea now of who's on the call in terms of that demographic distribution. Next slide, please. And I think you can close the poll results, Tim. That's just me. Okay. I'd now like to introduce Steve Fenton, who will talk to you about pre-submission tips for consideration.
Okay, thanks, Nolan. Good afternoon, or I guess for those of you on the West Coast, it's still morning. Good morning. Glad to have all of you here. I'm going to talk about pre-submission tips for consideration, as Nolan said. But first, wanted to give you a little background information. Make sure you have this because we're not sure where all of you are in the process, and some of these links may be helpful to you. Tim, can you put the link in the chat box to the FY25 Brownfields Job Training Grants webpage? At this site, the 3 links below, you can find all 3 of those at that site. The opportunity notice of the RFA, also grant guidelines, the job training guideline summary, and then these bullets, these links are also available off that initial link that Tim just put in the chat box. Frequently asked questions about Brownfields job training, those interested in applying for funding, the list of eligible and ineligible Brownfield job training courses, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth later, and also how to register and apply for grants, and how to submit an application through grants.gov. So all of these links are available off the initial link that Tim put in there. So you might want to bookmark that because these will be very helpful to you. Also, the link and these 2 links here, I'm going to ask Tim to put these in the chat box also. The first one is to additional background information that can be found on EPA's own technical assistance resources site. If you go there, there's a lot of really good information and some good links to other resource material. And then at the bottom, the Brownfield Job Training Grants tip sheet, which is also very important for you to take a look at. Okay, so this site is the KSU tab technical assistance website, which will have information on the webinar today. The recording will go up on this site along with the companion manual and the PowerPoint presentation. And if you weren't able to join us for the webinar on May 23rd, which was JT 101, establishing a successful Brownfields job training program, that recording, the companion manual, and a presentation are on this site as well. So this site you're going to want to bookmark. Okay, so each organization has their own approach to organizing and responding to grant applications. In many cases, a single individual will write the entire grant. In other situations, grant writing will engage several individuals with specialized knowledge in training and community development. Today's webinar presents tips and strategies suggested by successful EPA job training grantees and application reviewers that prospective applicants may wish to consider. Some of these tips have also come from the 3 of us that we've experienced and seen over the years as well. So the very first one seems pretty intuitive. Read the RFA very carefully, including the applicant eligibility paragraph, especially for those of you that are applying for the first time. This should be first and foremost, and you'd be surprised how many people do not read the entire RFA carefully initially. So that's why that is on this slide, to remind you to look at this very carefully. Also, deconstruct the RFA to ensure that every request for information is addressed in your application. Evaluators will deduct points if every request for information is not fully addressed. And along those lines, it's always a good strategy to identify a program manager or champion who will be responsible for ensuring that all the information requested is addressed. And for those of you who did not attend our webinar on May 23rd, or excuse me, this is the one on June 6th, the EPA application review webinar. If you weren't able to attend this one, the link to it is down below. You may want to take a look at that because there's some very good tips and information on their webinar that they did just last week. Okay, it's important to ensure that when the application is completed, it will be properly submitted to grants.gov for consideration. Here is a pre-submission checklist, which you should do upfront, and it'll help you save time later. Verify that your grant submission process is up to date. Are you set up to submit and administer the application using grants.gov and sam.gov? SAM is an acronym for System for Award Management. Do you have a unique entity identifier? Do you have a password? And is it up to date? You must use this account at least once a year for the account to remain active. If this is your first go round and you haven't done this yet, you'll want to do this as soon as possible. And if you run into any problems, they have a very good help desk. We've used it. I've actually had to go through this process to get a UAI, and that I can assure you that the help desk is valuable if you need help. And then the organization's eBiz point of contact must authorize the individual as the authorized organization representative, the person that will be submitting the grant. Now, this process can take 7 to 10 business days to fully complete the registration process for most funding opportunities. So again, you might want to get started on it sooner rather than later. Application development. Committing to apply can be a daunting task and a decision. Applications submitted this August will not be funded for about 9 months, with training to begin next fall. But this year, the FY25 RFA is a good time to apply. In the Notice of Funding Opportunities, they've indicated that 20 grants of up to 500,000, which totals 14 million, are available for applicants. Previous performance is not a slam dunk or guarantee of continued funding. Legacy programs need to demonstrate why their program deserves to be refunded or expanded. Because the Brownfields Job Training Program was established as a startup funding, application reviewers do not want to fund recycled application. For this reason, relationships must be updated with new offerings, commitments of support, and expanded partnerships. Returning grantees who are interested in continuing their program with a new grant must have closed out their previous grant or have dispersed at least 50% of the funds from that grant. And don't be deterred if your organization is a new applicant. EPA is aware that existing job training grantees have an advantage over new applicants because they have established relationships with employers, partners, and experience in environmental workforce training. However, special consideration is given to new applicants with well thought out program plans. Again, if in doubt, submit a job training application, even if more preparation could have resulted in a more complete response. Unsuccessful applicants will have opportunities to debrief and review their grant with suggestions for improvement. Unfunded applicants for this cycle will have a head start in the next competition. Take advantage of debriefing sessions, additional mentoring, and technical assistance between grant cycles. And another tip, circulate your program plans and progress reports to key partners during the development of the application. And defining community need. Community and labor market assessments form the foundation and rationale for developing a community-based Brownfields job training program. Demonstrating the need for a Brownfield job training program to application reviewers is essential before moving forward. As indicated here, use search engines, mapping tools, internet resources, and surveys for initial background and demographic information. This includes the use of things like EJ Screen or CGEST, which is the Climate Environmental Justice mapping tool, and also census data in your community. Now, one tip is if you haven't done this and you are kind of leery of doing it or are not sure how, you can always call your regional EPA office and ask for the Environmental Justice Office, and they will have people there who can help you navigate through the EJ Screen and CGEST mapping tools. Begin community and labor market assessments early with as large a net as possible. This activity takes time and requires significant research into local community and the labor market. And for those of you who did not attend our Job Training 101 webinar, you're encouraged to go online and download a copy of our companion manual, which covers these topics in great detail. And visit and get to know the neighborhoods that are under consideration in your target market. This includes community influencers, social services, nonprofits, and faith-based organizations. Those are folks in the neighborhoods who can help, help you out in terms of marketing the program and providing you information about the target area. And do not restrict employment searches to environmental related industries only. There are many other industries that have employment opportunities requiring environmental training and or certifications. Involve governmental and municipal agencies in the community and labor market assessments. Communicate with employers about their interest in hiring job training graduates, and maybe they won't be able to hire them, but maybe if they can even commit to interviewing them or considering them, that would be helpful. And identify and note any of the other 5 other factors checklist that may exist in a target community. Now, Blaise mentioned this early on in his presentation, and these other factors, these 5 other factors are on the list here in front of you. Applicants that propose to serve a community population of 10,000 or less, whether the applicant is new, in other words, you haven't received an EPA brownfield job training grant since at least 2015. The applicant is a federally recognized Indian tribe or U.S. territory, or is an organization that will primarily serve those populations. Applications that seek to serve veterans, and whether the target area is located within a community in which a coal-fired power plant has recently closed within the last 10 years. Okay, search and identify other incidents or situations that can reinforce your selection of the target community. And some of those other situations include the list here. Training in communities with unusually high crime rate, high unemployment rates, applications that seek to serve returning citizens, in other words, those returning from the criminal justice system, and applications that seek to serve special populations. Also, in your application, do not overlook other circumstances that could affect communities, such as the list in front of you here: opportunity zones, enterprise zones, redevelopment zones, community development projects. And then, have there been plant closures in the target community, chemical spills? Has a natural disaster affected the area? Or have there been accidents? These things are usually pretty newsworthy and are fairly easy to uncover. And they should all be considered when addressing community need. The key to successful job training programs is early adoption of the program by elected officials and governmental agencies before the grant application is written. Along those lines, the list here is very important. Brief the mayor's office and elected representatives and city council. Engage public, municipal, and service agencies, and consider reaching out to public utilities, the HUD, fire and rescue, public safety, and transportation and social services. Locate and contact the state and federal brownfields projects staff. Let them know that you're considering applying. And document a discussion of important public meetings and public events in the narrative section. And along these lines, document all meetings with a list of participants, the date held, and a summary of what was discussed. And if you've just started on this journey and you haven't written down these meetings that you've already had, I would encourage you to go back and recreate a list and then keep it ongoing, because you're going to want to include the documentation of some of these meetings in your RFA. Develop connections with faith-based community organizations and social service organizations and nonprofits. Don't forget to consider partnership development and resource leveraging simultaneously. Your best partners will leverage available resources, expanding program services. Recruit and commit partners to provide in-kind service, facility, or financial support, and request those letters of support referencing specific commitments being offered. If partnerships are included in the application, establish an MOU that is included in the attachment section of the application. Recruit advisory committee members and include them in the application submission. Advisory committee members could come from, you could have representatives from stakeholder communities, government agencies, training organizations, potential employers, leveraging partners, and philanthropic supporters. Those are the kinds of organizations that having a representative from those organizations on your advisory committee would be very important. And lastly, engage advisory committee and key partners in the proposal review process. It's always a good idea to have other people assist with the review process. Maybe one of your partners will have experience in grant writing that could be useful to you. It might be helpful for someone like that to review your proposal. Curriculum development. When developing the curriculum, start with employer needs and labor market assessment. And again, we covered these in great detail in the webinar on May 23rd. That's included in the link, the KSU tab site. You're going to want to take a look at that. When creating your training program, it's important to know which courses can be funded by Brownfield Job Training grant funds. And again, here's the link to the eligible and ineligible Brownfield's Job Training courses webpage. There are over 100 courses that are listed as eligible. There are a few courses that are ineligible, and there's actually a few other courses that are, well, like they could be eligible depending on circumstances. So you're definitely going to want to take a look at this link. Okay. Ensure that there is a clear distinction between supported and unsupported curriculum. It should be, outlined as such in your proposal. Complete and screen and select prospective trainers, contractors, and consultants early. And in that process, if you've decided you're not going to have training in-house and have a trainer on your staff, and you go out and look for a contract trainer, make sure contract trainers and consultants receiving over 10,000 are competitively selected. You'll need a minimum of 3 bids that's required for competitive selection. If contractors are selected before the application is submitted, they may be included as part of the grant. But one thing to keep in mind is contractual commitments must be contingent on receiving EPA funding. So make sure you note that in any agreement with them. Including advisors, employers, and trainers in the curriculum development component. Those are the folks that are going to really have a good feel for what the curriculum should be like. And then lastly, make sure that that curriculum is supported by the labor market assessment that you've done as well. And employer recruitment. Strong employer relationships usually result in high retention and placement rates. Successful graduates contribute to program awareness and enhance student recruitment. In addition to interviewing graduates, don't hesitate to ask potential employers to become leveraging partners, which could include things like, maybe they have facilities that you could use for training or perhaps equipment. So don't be bashful about asking about leveraging opportunities. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Nolan Curtis.
Thank you, Steve. Next slide, please. This is our second poll question. We're asking to help us gain a better understanding of where you are in the application process. As before, please take a minute to respond to the questions on your screen. In a minute or two, we'll have the results. Thank you. Okay, thank you. This gives us a pretty good idea of where you are in terms of your where you are in terms of the process of actually writing the application itself. Thank you, Tim. Next slide, please. I'd now like to discuss the process of writing the application. Although there's no single guaranteed approach, successful applications tend to follow similar patterns of organization and process. Next slide, please. It's important that your team has personnel. They can be staff or volunteers covering all of the critical components of your proposed job training operation. This includes the 7 areas listed here. You'll need an ongoing champion for each area who may also serve as the subject matter expert or SME. Even if the learning curve is steep, you'll need someone to be responsible for the function. Look around. Don't see anybody? That means it might have to be, well, you. Next slide, please. So you want to assign every request for information to the individual or team best suited to respond to the question. I strongly suggest firm timelines and deadlines for information gathering. This is for first drafts, reviews, second drafts, and so on. Keep to your schedule, all right? Make a plan, work the plan. Write the narrative first and then the 3-page summary. The narrative will provide information required to complete the 3-page summary. Be clear, concise, and address all criteria. And your numbers must add up. Make sure that those charged with budgets review cost and projected expenditures, double check numbers across the narrative, and compare them with the budget. Next slide, please. A general rule that helps legibility is to not use acronyms without defining them first. So this is like a foreign language test. Oftentimes we have certain phrases we use or terms of art or acronyms. Explain what they are before you continue to repeat them throughout the document. Don't assume that the evaluator will know anything about your program, your area, or your circumstance. Document extraordinary elements of your program. Work them into the narrative to receive the well-deserved credit for the extra effort. Remember, sometimes someone in another part of the country might review your application. A good example would be the differences in urban versus rural areas across the country, including socioeconomic, demographic, geographic, and environmental conditions. It's also possible that different people might review different sections of your application. They may be unaware of information you submitted in another section. So make sure that you respond to the prompt or request for information in the appropriate section. And then conduct frequent progress updates. Discuss the progress and direction of the proposal as a team. Meet regularly to report progress in responding to RFA information requests and identify roadblocks and problems early. Next slide, please. To ensure continuity and to avoid a piecemeal approach to your applications, a single individual should be responsible for writing the final proposal. Share the drafts of the proposal with advisors and key partners for review. This allows multiple people to take one last look at the proposal and catch any possible errors. Maintain a consistent writing style and avoid making conflicting statements. If possible, even have someone who's unfamiliar with the grant and process do a review. Does this make sense? Have you spoken in plain English? Submit the application early to allow for any issues that may occur along the way. This allows for any problems that may occur with sam.gov. And call the www.grants.gov help desk for assistance. They're very good and they're very helpful. Next slide, please. So to review some of the key strategies, remember to dissect the RFA and break out each section and deliverable. Identify every request for information. I prefer to actually spread this out on a wall, kind of like on a war wall or a war room, rather than simply have it stacked up on my computer monitor because it's too easy to miss pages. And this way I can see the whole proposal in front of me. Assign every request for information to the individual best suited to respond to the question. Commit everyone to a deliverable and a deadline for each activity. I can't stress how important this is. And ensure your team has the personnel or volunteers for covering all of the critical components of the job training operation, including the community outreach, recruitment, training, retention, case management, partnership development, and employer relationships. Conduct frequent progress updates, as we have said, and discuss this progress and direction of the proposal as a team, meeting regularly and reporting the progress and responding to the request. As the narrative is constructed, avoid generalizations. Next slide, please. And again, a reminder that previous performance is not a slam dunk or guaranteed of continued funding. So they don't want recycled requests if you already have a grant. They want to know what's going to be new or different. And EPA is aware that the existing grantees have an advantage. And so therefore, they are looking for and interested in drawing in new qualified providers to serve areas of need. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the third question we are asking to help us gain a better understanding of who you are. As before, please take a minute to respond to the questions on your screen, and in a minute or two, we'll have the results. Okay, I think this gives us a good idea in terms of your experience in submitting applications. I see that we have a lot of new first timers. So hang in there. Don't let us drown you with this drinking from the fire hydrant routine that we got. And so I'd now like to turn it over to my good colleague, Steve Fenton.
Okay, thank you, Nolan. Okay, let's see. All right. Okay, a few more things that I would like to share with you. Perform a quality check to make sure that each section is legible, succinct, and complete, and also consistent at each handoff stage. Make sure that it's all like a coordinated document and it doesn't, look fragmented. Circulate your draft to key partners before final submission. And another advantage and something you should take advantage of actually is send your draft application to the nearest tab office for an application review. This is a great service and at no cost to you. Your nearest regional tab office, we have tab office contact information in the manual and also on this presentation. And you can call them, and I would call them, let them know that you're intending on sending in your application for review. Give the regional tab point of contact a minimum of 3 days to review your application and provide feedback. But talking to them ahead of time, you can get a better feel for the exact time frame. And don't wait until there's only 10 business days left for the application closing date to do this, because you run the risk of maybe not getting it back in time. And one last tip I would like to offer is, yes, we have heard that an applicant did this and then ended up turning right around and submitting this same document with the notes from the tab folks that were in the margin of the application. They went ahead and sent it to EPA that way. That's not a good idea. So make sure you have time to act on those recommendations and get it filled out properly. And lastly, submit the application early to allow for any glitches that may occur along the way. You never know what's going to happen, with your with internet or anything else. So I would always back it up a few days, give yourself a little breathing room between when you submit the proposal and when it's actually due to make sure it all goes through. Again, if in doubt, submit a job training application, even if more preparation could have resulted in a better program plan. And I mentioned this, I believe, earlier, but unsuccessful applicants have that opportunity to debrief and review their grant with suggestions for improvement. And those not funded have a head start on the next competition with additional mentoring. And review the tips and strategies before submission. You have the tips and strategies in our session here. You've also got tips from EPA on that tips link that we provided earlier. I would take a look at all of them. And personally, if I found anything of helpful, that was helpful, even if it took a while to go through it, it would be helpful if it made my proposal better. And make sure to double check the numbers one more time. Sometimes the numbers in the narrative don't match with the budget, etc. So make sure they're consistent. Okay, and this just kind of follows what Blaze mentioned earlier. Just again, the reminder, I've bolded the 12-point font. Last time it was 11-point font, I believe, and also 14-page narrative instead of 15-page narrative. And then you'll see the font types underlined: Times New Roman, Arial, Calibri font. Those are the ones. It all has to be submitted in one PDF with no photos allowed. So make sure you follow those guidelines. And then don't let this happen to you. Submit your application on time. Believe it or not, some prospective applications go through the application process, or applicants, they go through this application process, but they don't submit their application on time. And I've heard this numerous times. So don't let this happen to you, which is why it's a good idea, again, to have a little redundancy built into your program and have, what happens if the person who's supposed to submit the proposal is gone and you're down to the last week or 10 days? Do you have a backup plan? Give that some thought on what you can do to make sure that proposal gets in. You've worked hard on it, so make sure it gets submitted. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it back to Nolan.
Okay, so this is the fourth and final question we're asking to help us gain a better understanding of where you are in the application process. So as before, please take a minute to respond to the questions on your screen, and in a minute or two, we'll have the results for you once again. Thank you. Okay, again, thank you for your responses. We still see that many of you are on the fence. I'd encourage you to just go for it. Because again, even if it's not the perfect response, you go for it, you submit it, you get incredible feedback, and or it might be able to clear the bar. You never quite know. Next slide, please. So Mike and I will both be covering the last section on mistakes and lesson learned. I know everybody's been waiting patiently for Mike Sinney to make an appearance, and he will, I promise you. I'm pretty good on mistakes, so I'm going to take the first part of this. But the recent EPA webinar on the FY 2025 Brownfields Job Training Grant contains an excellent and detailed review of the grant application process, excuse me, with respect to how the various sections of your application are scored. However, there are specific errors that may result in lost points and/or a lost opportunity. Over the past several application cycles and through our experience, we've gathered critical feedback. Here are some examples of comments that have resulted in an early rejection of the applications. These are deal killers. Next page, please. Okay, so as so a number of things. The application was submitted with another organization's account information. So or you use the wrong UEI number. And so you must make sure that all of those grants.gov, sam.gov, your UEI numbers, all of those are correct and up to date. The applicant did not pass the threshold criteria. So to find your UEI number, we have the application site on grants.gov, PROD's WordPress in the notes, and we're posting it to the chat. The submitter is not the authorized organization representative. So remember, one person has to register as the organization representative, and that is the submitter. The applicant did not have an active www.sam.gov account and had another party submit the application package on their behalf. Again, you got to do it for yourself. Make sure all of these accounts are current and up to date and accurate. Next slide, please. I reviewed a number of applications for a number of different agencies, and this is the real deal killer. The applicant did not follow guidelines. Doesn't matter how good it might have been, oftentimes they're not even read. So if you don't do what's asked, don't expect them to do you any favors. Another one is that the proposal is difficult to understand, and this can be caused by an applicant not responding to the criteria in sequence, or sometimes a piecemeal approach where it just doesn't read consistently. The applicant response to subcategories were not on point and are incomplete and were unclear. So any criteria that's left unaddressed may result in 0 points given for that criteria. So you want to make sure you score as many points as you can, but at least some points, even if an area isn't really strong. And then finally, as we've said over and over and over, the application was submitted late. Next slide, please. So in the ranking criteria, and this is the criteria that Blaze reviewed at the beginning of this presentation. And so we're going to go through some of the mistakes that were made in each individual section. So in the community needs, remember there's a total of 200 points. This is worth almost a quarter of your total points, and it's a 45-point total. The community description is a big part of that community needs total. So the environmental, social, and economic issues weren't linked to the impact of brownfields in the targeted area. And so, okay, I'm sorry. Also be aware that the point totals are not the final determination of the application quality. And so, again, there are those other factors that were mentioned that do affect the overall review of the application. The demographic stats were provided, but no contrasting data from state, county, city, or national statistics to show the need. Community involvement in the notification regarding the proposed job training project was not discussed in detail. So again, you need to get down a little bit into the weeds and say, this is why this matters in this community. Next slide, please. It's important that you mention the public meetings, the attendance records, and the community roles in the development and composition of the job training proposal. These are community-based job training proposals, so you need to articulate the community involvement. There is no mention of social and public health issues. What is the problem that this will help solve? Not just underemployment or unemployment, but also how does the cleanup of the brownfield site help with social and public health issues? There is no mention of a specific population to be trained. Who's your target audience for the training program? And is that an impacted audience that should be of concern? And the demographic data was provided, but it was sporadic and not cohesive. So you need to have, a clear set of that demographic data, but also it needs to account for the community overall. Next slide, please. So you can see here that the specific environmental concerns need to be connected to the brownfields in the community, and that needs to be discussed. The demographic stats need to be indicative of need. So again, it's one thing to have a certain population distribution, but is this also an affected population that's underrepresented, underserved, underemployed? The sensitive population was not discussed. So do you have any groups or subgroups that are especially sensitive and can take advantage of this opportunity that you're providing through the job training? And then there was no discussion regarding outreach recruitment to target populations. How are you going to reach these people that you're putting in the proposal? What are your processes and methodologies, and who are your partners? And how do you justify the need for training with respect to the unemployment statistics? Next slide. Again, environmental justice needs to be addressed. There needs to be a mention of the brownfields, and the EJ screen or CJS need to be used in assisting to locate the target communities. Next slide, please. So in the labor market demand, which is the other 20 points of that section, the applicant failed to link labor market assessment to the curriculum. So the curriculum that you are teaching, how does that tie into the needs of those employers? Because after all, this isn't just training people, it's making sure there's a job that's possible at the end of that training. The applicant missed direct coordination with local employers. You need to document those conversations, those interactions, and hopefully those MOUs with local employers who are at least willing to give a look at the people coming out of your programs, if not commitments to hire. And a labor market assessment or employer survey was not presented adequately. Next slide, please. And so feeding on that, you need to have evidence that you directly surveyed or polled your local employers. And as Steve mentioned, cast a wide net rather than a narrow net. The job data by employment type sector concentration from earlier years is not current. So there's a number of tools to help with this, but make sure that you have current job employment data. And then there was no evidence of contact with potential employers. So sometimes people said, well, we're going to do this training program and people should want to hire them, but they've never even gone out and talked to the employers or been out in the community. So I'd now like to turn things over to Mike Sinia, who will continue with more on the ranking criteria review. Mike?
Thanks, Nolan. What we're trying to do at the tail end of this presentation is give you some examples, as Nolan suggested, of things that have cost points. We've got 200 points, and from there, the evaluators start deducting points on each of these ranking criteria. So we're pointing these out. They're not all of them, but they're ones that are commonly committed by new grantees and even experienced grantees. But as far as the training program description, this is the training part of it. There are 25 points involved. One of the common mistakes is they're listing key courses using federal funds, but they're not eligible for federal funds. You have to remember that Brownfield's key curriculum that's going to be funded by EPA have to have some relationship to Brownfield sites, community involvement in those sites or site preparation. You can have other courses, but not being funded by EPA. Another common mistake as far as the training goes is training facilities. People forget to mention, where are they going to be training their students? Is their headquarters clear across town? Or is it a neighborhood where the target community can't reach? Are there bus routes that go to the training facility? This all has its impact on retention. You've got to have the training in the target community or as easily reachable from where your target community is for your training facility to work. Of course, you have to make sure that your students are not being burdened by excessive fees. Remember, this is a government subsidized program. They are going to be fees for equipment, licensing fees. Those should be free. You should get pluses for making sure that there is no cost to the student. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to be talking about budget. Next slide. As far as budget goes, do what your organization usually does. Don't have excessive salaries or jack up your travel or mileage costs. Just do what you normally do and you'll just be fine. One thing that you have to remember to do, which many grantees fail to do, is every 18 months there is a national brownfields conference where all of the vendors go. We go. KSU is always represented. It's a great place to meet potential employers nationally and even locally every 18 months. Of course, the job training program usually has an all grantee meeting that occurs every other year. And that's in Alexandria, Virginia. It's a chance to meet EPA regional coordinators and headquarters people. So we've got two basic conferences, one 18 months apart. It's a national brownfields conference, and that tends to be a little expensive. You have to pay travel, expenses at the hotel. That varies from conference to conference. And then the one in Alexandria, which is every other year. In the past, EPA has subsidized the cost of the rooms, but you still have to pay your own travel. So there are costs there. You may also have some local, very good conferences. Often there are scholarships available. You want to especially attend the local conferences because your employers are there, and that's something you have to play in. So make sure that that's included in the budget. Next slide. The next slide is a biggie. Budget numbers don't add up. This is a very, very common mistake. And it tends to happen when not enough eyes are looking at the grant, or you're putting it together in pieces and you're not paying attention to what might read in the narrative and what appears on the table. Some of our grantees find it easier to do the tables first. Get your tables down, and then as you write the narrative, make sure they match the tables. Again, this is a big point killer when they're reading, well, you said it would cost this in one place and this in another, or you provided 1% in one place and something in another. Again, consistency is extremely important. Yeah, and in fact, on that topic, use as many numbers as you can. Be as analytical as you can throughout your grant. Often, people would not make a distinction between EPA-funded programs and non-EPA funded. For example, as we spoke before, licensing and certificate fees. Hopefully, those will be free to the applicant. But if they're going to be covered by the grant funds, they have to be identified. If they're not, who's going to be providing them? You may have a partner who's paying for PPE, or you may have a discretionary fund that you're using. Make sure you're identifying what costs will be expended by the students and what is covered and what is not. The next ranking criteria, as Blaise mentioned early on, it's actually the number one in point totals. It's program structure, anticipated outputs and outcomes. As Blaise had mentioned, EPA is really interested in the community need, and then what are what are you going to do about it? What are your outcomes? And there's 4 sub-criteria in this. Basically, the outcomes and outputs. This is what you're going to be doing. You want to make sure that your work plan is consistent with your outcomes. When your grant application is accepted, you're going to be going over your work plan. You want to be consistent that as you state what your outcomes are going to be, they should look identical to what your work plan will be as you begin this project. Often people won't do a milestone chart. And again, as I said, if you do your charts, you do your milestone charts, you do your timelines and work backwards, it gives you a little bit of consistency as you're working through this program. One of the issues that we talk about in several of these sub-criteria, what are you going to be doing about retention and attrition? How many students are going to be graduating? How many are coming into the program? How many will be trained? And how many will be placed? Next slide. There was no mention of the training facilities I had mentioned, especially access to those facilities. It didn't have a placement goal, as I said. You've got to have placement and you've got to be tracking. Now, the RFA requires 1-year tracking. We have had grantees who track forever. Okay, you could go 1 year, 2 years. The more you do, the better off your program's going to look like. You may have refreshers where graduates come back and it's a plus for your program as motivators of your students. But you have to make sure you track at least for 1 year. And people just, once they get to graduation, they forget about it. And then sometimes even before that. And those are all grant application killers. Make sure you mention how you're going to attract these students and how you're going to interact with your employers once they leave. Sometimes they don't talk about retention. This is extremely important, and it blends into the next subcategory, which is recruitment and screening. Those of you who have been attending the PLCs know how much we emphasize your screening and recruitment of students. The best class is the best class that you've recruited. It's like a baseball or football team. If you're good at screening and recruiting your students, you're going to have a winning season. If you just take anyone because you're panicked, you're going to have problems, particularly with retention. You won't have motivated students, or you might have students that are just along for the ride. So as far as your recruitment, you've got to describe how you're going to screen your students to get the best class possible. If you're going to be doing things like hazardous materials transportation, are you going to be paying for vision tests, or how are you going to be doing that? It gets back to the whole issue of student costs. As far as literacy screening, most of our grantees are aiming for the 9th or 10th grade of language and math skills. That'll depend on your Workforce Investment Board, what's commonly used in your area. And we're going to be talking about that as far as partnerships go, but you want to make sure that there is some sort of literacy screening, or perhaps not. You may be using just a GED as your evidence that they'll be able to survive the courses without remedial education. Drug testing is a sensitive issue. It always was. And it varies from locality to locality. Some places it's not an issue. Some places it's a very big issue. This will depend on your local ordinances. One thing you want to keep in mind, though, is if in certain occupations, they may want you, and you're going to have to talk to your partners and your employers. They will not consider someone who hasn't been drug tested, or perhaps they will tell you that before they can be employed, they're going to be taking a drug test. So you're going to have to decide early on in your screening process what you want to do as far as drug testing. Now, whatever you do, you want to make sure you address it in your RFA, because again, that's a point deductor. Program support. Next slide, please. No letters of support. People would not put letters of support from their partners in there, from governmental organizations or Brownfields training program. we want to have as much support from the community and from the government as possible. So when you start looking at your attachments, which we'll talk about in a minute, you're going to want to make sure that you've got letters of support coming from the government and from the community. You want to make sure that your community organizations are encouraging the program. That's going to help your retention tremendously. Again, if you have no community involvement and you don't mention community involvement, that's going to be minus points, because as we said in the very beginning, this is all about the community, and it links into how you're going to be recruiting. So if you don't mention it, you've got an issue. Next slide. The final issue or sub-criteria for program structure has to do with sustainability. Originally, the job training program was set up as a starter program where the federal government would provide some startup funds. That has changed over the years. They do want you to have partners, and you have to be thinking about what happens as, whether it's a 3-year or 5-year program, what happens as you come towards the end. We do have programs that have gotten state funding. They've been in the state programs. They don't need the federal program anymore. What happens if there's a year or two lag between when your last year ends and perhaps you decide to re-up and you don't get the grant? You want to have some provisions of what your sustainability will look like. You may be thinking of have something in terms of merging with another training organization. You may decide to get supplemental funding from legislature, from other people, but you want to definitely address it. It's 5 points, and every point counts in this evaluation. Next slide, please. I'm going to be talking, and I've got a series of 4 slides, and they're going to go very quick. This is all about collaboration. And this slide is no mention of federal, state, or local brownfields activities. They just ignored it. They didn't even talk about it. Next slide. These are all worth about 5 points. No mention of working with the local workforce investment board. Everyone should be working with the workforce investment board, as for no other reason, for giving TAB tests, referring students to you, screening your students for additional funds that they may get from the Labor Department. You want to touch base with the Workforce Investment Board, and you want to make sure it's in your proposal. If you don't have it, people have lost points because they didn't mention them. Next slide, please. Collaboration with the community. I've talked about that. You've got to have support from nonprofit organizations and community organizations. And as Blaise mentioned, redundancy, redundancy, redundancy. You want to mention these things in different places. Make sure that they are partners, but they're also involved in your community need and throughout the whole program. In terms of your training program, your recruitment program, you need support from your community organizations. Next slide. Most important, collaboration as far as partnerships go. You've got to have collaboration with your employers. Again, this is a program, it's a training program, but the primary goal is to train and place. And so your end result is placing. Sometimes we tell people work backwards. You've got to have a good relationship with employers. You need support from employers. More than that, you need letters of support from employers. Now, you don't necessarily have to get them a total commitment to hire your graduates, because they don't know what projects are coming down the stream, but you do have to ask them to look at your students. And the way you approach this is, will you look at our students? And as I said, you want to have them put that in your letter of support, that they will look at your students. Again, that will get you points rather than deduct points. And of course, no placement goals were stated. That's also fits under your outputs and outcomes, that you've got to have your input, how many you're going to be recruiting, how many you're going to retain, and how many you're going to place. So finally, we come to the last couple of ranking criteria: leveraging. How are you going to leverage your program? Obviously, as you have been listening to us, you see that you can't do this with just the EPA grant. You need some sort of leveraging, but there's lots of sources of leveraging, in-kind commitments, and you want to put a monetary value on it. And these are your best estimates in your proposal, and they may change as you go, but you want to put some kind of value on these in-kind commitments. And these in-kind commitments are worth a lot more than you may think. Someone is donating their time, they're donating resources in kind. They may be giving you cash, but you want to definitely keep track and keep a tally of all of these commitments, and you want to put this under this leveraging category. That and again, do a table and for your own benefit, who's going to contribute, what are they going to contribute, and the ones that are significant, you want to get letter of support from them. And more important, if they're significant contributors and you mention them in the grant, you're going to want to get some sort of an MOU from them. MOA, MOU, it's basically a memorandum of understanding that they are going to donate a full-time person. IBM, for example, often has employees doing in-kind commitments. And what is the value of having an IBM employee half-time for a year or 2 years? So you definitely want to have those estimates in your plan, and it's worth valuable points. Again, if you don't have it mentioned, you're going to zero out on that category. Capability. What is your program capability? Do you have an organization? Is this organization, does this organization amount to a grant writer who's just responding to something that in grants.gov? EPA wants to see if you've got a grant management system in place. Next slide. Do they have an organizational structure? Is there an organizational chart? Again, is there a real organization here? Or are we talking about a one-man show or someone who's going to try to assemble something on the fly if they're lucky to get the grant? Again, that's worth 10 points. And if you don't have an organizational structure, you will lose points. Past performance. This is a logical thing for the EPA to ask. They score it as 10 points out of the 25 points in your capability. It can be a little confusing. There are three options here. If you've had a grant, a job training grant in the last 10 years, which dates back to 2015, you want to put down what those grants were. If for example, if you're re-upping, you're reapplying for a grant, you can get 10 points, provided that you provide them with your results, that you've had your quarterly reports on time, which we'll talk about in future events. You've responded to the ACRES program. You've done your drawdowns in logical sequence. That's worth 10 points. But you say, hey, we've never done this before. Maybe we've had a federal grant, but or a non-federal grant. Maybe we've had a student grant. You can still get 5 points, but you have to mention it. Make sure you did not have an EPA job training grant, but you did have a grant, and explain what it was, and you'll get 5 points. More important, if you say nothing, you're going to get a 0. That's 10 points. You don't want to lose the 10 points. So you either are going to respond that you've had an EPA grant and you're going to respond to that on how great you did, or no, you don't have a grant, or perhaps you've had a grant, it was a state grant or a philanthropic grant, and you did a great job on it, and you'll get a neutral score. Please put down something. Lastly, next slide, please. Lastly, we're going to talk about attachments. And we've really hit this topic already. You want to have all your letters of commitment from your governmental organizations, their partners, your community partners, who are going to suggest that they will support your program, help you recruit students, that they like your training program. It's going to help the community. You're going to have MOUs from people who are included in the proposal. If someone's going to be providing lunches to your students, the local McDonald's, you get it in writing and put it in the attachment section. Most important, you want to have employer letters of support and commitment. Again, have them consider your program graduates. Better yet, if they'll commit to hiring, that's fantastic. But you want them to say, this is a great program. And remember, you're going to be tailoring your program around your employers, and they're going to be getting students that are vetted and have $5,000 or $6,000 worth of training. So they should be happy to look at the students and you just want to ask them to send you a letter of commitment. Definitely all of these partners that we've talked about, make sure they have the letters of support. And don't do this. Don't send them a letter of support and have them sign it and send it back to you. Well, have them state what the role is going to be, what they're willing to do for you, what kind of commitment they're willing to make. Those are worth lots and lots of points as far as EPA is concerned in getting those firm commitments from employers. So that kind of runs it through, the mistakes people have made, common mistakes that have cost them points. And again, you want to maximize your points, and you go on from there. It doesn't mean everything, but it will mean a lot. It's kind of one of those things, not necessarily, it's a grading on the curve, but you've got to make sure that you write a fundable proposal and get as many points as you can in addition to all the other considerations EPA has. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nolan. Nolan?
Thank you, Mike. Next
Mike,
slide.
But before, I was going to ask Mike about the PLCs. Could you mention
Well,
that's something these folks might be interested in?
They may be. That's something that we're going to be continuing. It's this webinar is not the end. We'll be doing a professional learning community. We call them PLCs. They're the third week in every month. Because of Juneteenth on the 19th, our next PLC is going to be June 29th. And then the following will be the third week in July, which would be July 17th. Now, those two PLCs will focus on doing the best job you can in submitting your job training program. The one on the end of this month, we're going to be talking about things that may have been glossed over in the RFA and in the EPA presentation, things that are maybe hard to understand or they're new to people. So we're going to be covering those on the 29th. And then on July 17th, we're going to be talking again, similar to this, but do's and don'ts, landmines, just before you submit. It's almost like a checklist of re-examine your grant proposal. You could still make some tweaks on July 17th before you submit your grant. Of course, after that, we're going to be shifting totally. Our total gears will be shifted towards technical assistance and what we can do for new grantees and existing grantees and legacy grantees. We're going to be having an all grantee meeting on the 18th of, on August 21st. Of course, these will be due on the 15th. And after that, we're totally shifting the gears of KSU job training technical assistance to what can we do and what are the sources of technical assistance for people who actually have grants or people who are submitting grants and want to know more on additional resources of how to run your program, what programs are out there to help keep track of your students. And that'll be happening right after August 15th. And of course, we'll be having another PLC in September that'll cover again those resource issues. So thanks, Steve, for reminding me about that. And now we'll turn it over to
a quick one for Mike on the date of the PLC for June. Is it the 26th or the 29th?
It's Wednesday. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that'd be Wednesday the 26th.
That's right. Well, so you're much younger than I am, Nolan. So you're a little more alert. Yeah,
by several months.
Okay, I've got the 26th, and it'll be again the fourth Wednesday. We do things very routinely, usually the third Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Now this will be not the third, but the fourth on the 26th. Thanks, Nolan.
Okay, thank you, Mike and Steve. And I want to do a quick time check because we are at the end of our 90 minutes, but we really have a few more minutes. We hope that you can hang in there. We respect you and we respect your time, but we did want to take some time to hear from you and answer any questions that you might still have at this point. And so if you do have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll try to get to it in the next few minutes before our time is up. And also the three of us will be available for a little while after the end of the webinar. So, you know, we can have that little, if you want to hang out and chat just a little bit, we'll be able to do that. So at this point, are there any general questions or other questions that are being put forward?
Yeah, let me say really quick, Nolan, that I'm kind of re-putting some of the questions that haven't been answered yet that have come in by chat into the chat box so we can just look at them. And some may be things we need to refer folks to EPA for, but in case there's any any comments you have, please take a look at those, Mike, Steve, and Nolan. And I might also say that while you're thinking about if you have any additional questions, please, sometimes it helps go to the QR code there, scan it with your phone, and think about providing some feedback to us, and then you may generate some extra questions you'd like to ask. So encouraging you to be thinking about that evaluation too. I'm going to continue to paste in some questions in the chat box for Steve, Mike, and Nolan to look at. Thanks.
If you are a newer nonprofit that might be considering a one-man band at the moment, would it be a bad idea to submit a grant? We're thinking about it. Might springboard into other opportunities. We always take the stand of when in doubt, submit. Okay, and as Nolan said, whatever happens, whether you're knocked out on, if you get past the threshold, try to pass the threshold. If you can't pass the threshold, then you're not going to get past 15 days into the grant. But if you can pass that threshold, submit and let them give you comments on where you're weak. They'll also put you on their regional listserv, and you'll be tied into all the technical assistance for the next year. So next year's a whole new story. So I would say if you're new, submit.
Okay, well, we're getting some questions in the chat area, so I'd like to let's talk about those really quick, see if we have some answers, and I can just read them if that helps kind of everybody.
Sure, that would help.
Hear about that. Okay, so again, some we may just need to defer to EPA to answer, but one question was, are EPA employees ineligible to serve on an advisory committee since it's an EPA grant? Anybody have a thought on that? And again, if we don't know, it's fine to just let an EPA person chime in.
Are any EPA people still on who can respond to that?
Alma and Bill were on. Are they still on either?
we're starting to lose people. So my first guess, well, actually, I don't want to guess. So we'll have to find out and get back to you. But
Great.
I'm still here, but I'm not sure when they say an advisory committee, they're talking about somebody advising right now and for an application. The only time we can, if that's the question, the answer is no. But can you, Blaze, maybe you're understanding the question better than I can try to help.
And I lost who actually asked it, but I think it has to do with once you've got a grant and you've got an advisory committee, and I think you probably may not be able to pay them for sure if they're a federal employee, but I don't know.
I know that I've been included before after they've had the grant. I've never been able to attend the meetings, but every now and then they would ask for my input. And I might, like the employers are suggesting this. What do you think, Alma?
Yep.
And I was able to kind of give my 2 cents, but I never had time to attend their meetings. But several communities did put me on it. And I don't know the others. My guess is other EPAs. So I think the answer is we're not prohibited after you have the grant to be able to give input, right? But the reality of it is most of us probably don't have enough time to be joining you on the, to join these specific meetings themselves. So sometimes grantees will get our input otherwise once they get the advice from, their advisory committee. And then usually it requires our approval anyway, if they're going to make some major change. Like I did have one that they changed the curriculum because the employers for some time had been saying that there was, they weren't really utilizing this particular training anymore. And you can imagine 3-year grants up to 5-year grants, things change over time, right? And so they replaced one course with 3 courses that was what the employers were looking for. And unfortunately, the time that it took for that to really for them to listen to that, there was a death that occurred that was really convincing. It wasn't related to our program, but they learned from that because the employers had already been sounding the alarm. Hey, we're not using this. Can we have this? We're seeing these problems. And then there literally was a death in that particular state where the grantee was located. And they came in and then requested, that I approve replacing the one course that the people weren't utilizing with 3 courses, which included one of the 3 that had caused the death. It was like something tag out, for a safety issue.
Tag out,
Blackout, tag
That's
out.
it, exactly.
Another aspect of a way to look at this is if we encourage people to form an advisory committee before they submit their grant proposal. And of course, if you have a potential evaluator on your list of advisors, they're going to have to recuse themselves of providing any information regarding your program.
Yeah, I would not list us for certain. Definitely would not list us.
Right.
And
So-
probably we need to move on just to get to some more questions
Yeah.
at this point. But just sort of if there's a quick resource or answer for this, if it's applicable, is there an instructor list we can select trainers from? I think, again, that might be a hard one to answer. These are all local programs,
through
right?
the PLC, we've been able to provide resources for instructor and instructor training, but there isn't a list per se because it's depends. And Steve's really our expert there on the trainer training.
There's also a list of OSHA certified trainers on OSHA's site. And we have that link in our last webinar's companion manual and materials. I don't have it in front of me. We can look it up and see if we can drop it in the chat though. That would be a source. If some of your training is OSHA related, there is a list of trainers, OSHA certified trainers, that you can, it's a searchable database that you can search by city or state. So you might get some ideas for some trainers there.
Right. Also, your local technical community college is a very good resource. Fire departments are a very good resource. So we discuss these in the PLCs about where you might find or, in a sense, build your own trainers, having people from your own organization become certified as trainers.
Thanks. And I'm just putting in the chat the KSU job training website, and you scroll down midway, you'll see all of the professional learning committee information about, past things, past events, and there's future ones. If you registered for this webinar, we'll send you information about future meetings like that. Alma, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a shout out to your resource. And then secondly, because that is a great resource. And then secondly, I know that job centers, each of the state, the Department of Labor funds all these job centers at every state and then local communities, right? And they oftentimes have, depending on the state, they may have like a list of providers. So you might reach out to some of them as well. They may know that. I only learned that through the one that I work with, which was Full Employment Council. Like the state of Missouri does some big competitive thing, and then they just tap into the already pre-approved providers. So they might be able to give you some help as applicants. I don't know. I've never used it myself, clearly, but I know that that might be a resource for you. So you might check that out.
Right. So again, be a little careful because sometimes people will represent themselves as trainers, but they're not certified, they're not qualified. So, make sure you're getting certified trainers just for the, good of your program, but mostly for the safety and good of your people.
Good.
I put that link in of the OSHA Institute that has the trainer list, the searchable database. So that might be helpful. But like Nolan said, always, vet all of them, all the individuals, make sure they're good.
Okay, thanks. So there was some back and forth also question. It sounds like kind of a grants.gov submission question regarding, whether the applicant of record, and shared. It sounds like a grants.gov thing, but I wondered if anyone, I'll just read it. To clarify a bit, can someone with workspace manager privileges in grants.gov fill in the application in grants.gov and then send via grants.gov to the AOR? And I don't know the answer to that, but if anyone else does, pipe up.
I don't have a clue either.
Yeah,
I think it circles around the other way. So, you have to register someone as the AOR. And so the submittal should be from the AOR.
Right.
And so that was one of the fatal flaws we saw when it was submitted by somebody else and that person wasn't.
I would really encourage, I would really encourage folks to, there's a tips sheet for grants.gov, and probably even more valuable if you have your own department that, submits grants for your organization, or if you know another organization that has one of those departments, talk to them and figure out how it works. But it's complicated, so you have to start doing that right away to get answers to these questions. But I'm sorry, we don't.
This is Gary Dovey. I've done this in the past, and you can authorize a grant person as an AOR. It's within grants.gov. You can see how to do it. It's not hard, but the actual entity that's the AOR has to authorize him to do it. So,
okay. All right, thanks.
Yeah. If we could, I think we're gonna continue to lose a few people. Maybe if we could go back to 77, slide 77, and then we'll, stay a little later for some of these other questions.
That sounds good.
Did we stop the recording?
No, keep recording. Next slide,
keep
please.
Going.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
There's 77.
Okay, so just to wrap up, things you've heard before, the application deadline is August 15, 2024. Don't miss it, don't be late. A key one, costs associated with the application process are not recoverable under the grant. So whoever you have to hire or pay or whatever you do, you don't get that money back. So that's an investment in the grant process. Again, carefully read the RFA in its entirety. Select a program manager to oversee all content and deliverables. You need somebody with a mean streak, somebody who can be a taskmaster. This is not the time to be nice. It's the time to be effective and efficient. Follow all the RFA guidelines, respond to all sections and questions, review your application. Is it understandable, legible? Is it complete? Have TAB review your application. So, get it to them a little bit before it's due. Work with them, and they'll actually go through it one time and give you some good hints. and submit the application on time or preferably several days early, okay, to avoid any kinds of problems. Next slide. So we've listed here in the companion document resources that you have both in EPA and in the TAB regions. Again, the EPA, now that the RFA is out, can talk about threshold criteria questions, but they can't answer direct questions, as I understand it, on the application itself during that process. However, the TAB regional directors can give you technical assistance and review of the draft applications. So next slide. Next slide. So you can see we have the EPA job training coordinators, and there's other resources in our offices, as Steve mentioned, for things like environmental justice and helping you coordinate with that. Next slide.
Nolan, Alma
Yeah.
has her hand raised.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Alma.
Oh, I just wanted to say that as far as calling us with questions, they can ask us technical questions still, and we can answer, but then that responses go public. Does that make sense? So that's
Sure.
because sometimes that's how we add to the new FAQs. What we can't
Okay.
do is like strategy or coach, essentially. And there
Right,
should be
so-
no excuse on threshold failing. Because if you have any question in your mind as to whether you're going to pass threshold, you should be asking your regional contact and submitting your question. We should be able to answer it or run it through our lawyers and confirm with headquarters. And then you should know whether you're going to pass threshold. That's like there's no excuse for not passing threshold, unless of course you just aren't an eligible entity, and we'll let you know that, right?
Right. Thank you, Alma. That's very helpful. Okay, and then we have all the resources for the regional tabs. I'm sorry, there's something from Eliza. So go back 2 slides, I guess.
I'm putting it in the chat. I'm answering.
EPA region, well, she said no, region 2. There's EPA region 2. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah,
She
I
said
would-
there was no region 2 contact, so I was.
there is. I chatted it
Okay.
in there. It was just
Okay,
fast.
all right.
We
So
scrolled through
next
fast.
slide. Next slide. And again, these are in the document, so I know it's hard to scribble this quickly. Next slide. Next slide. But don't worry, we got you covered. Okay, so again, we really want to hear your feedback. It's very important. It's critical to us so that we can make these more exciting. So if you need a car chase or a battle scene or better special effects during the presentation, as well as just what kinds of information and how we should be running these things, or things we do or don't do, or what you think, please click on the link or on the QR code, and we would like to hear your feedback on this webinar. Next slide. So in closing, I want to say thanks to the many minds and hands that made this production possible, especially to Blaise Levin. He's the director of KSU TAB programs, and Blaise, thank you very much. To Tim Hunter of Lucid Waste Solutions. He's behind the scenes, but he makes all of this go. He's our IT and technical support person. I want to thank my KSU JT TAB colleagues, Mike Sinew and Steve Fenton, and most importantly to all of you. Thank you for your time, your patience, and we want to encourage you. We want to encourage you. What you are doing, what you are trying to do is so critically important for our communities, and only you can do this. And so however we can help you, whatever we can do to help you, help the people around you, it's critically important that you lean into this and lean forward. And we encourage you to join the professional learning community because it's very supportive. There are people like you who are running these grants all over the country, and they're very helpful. We're not competitive, we're cooperative, and they can give you a lot of advice. So if you make it through this gate of the application, you're not going to be walking alone. You have a very good support group. Next slide. So we also encourage you to contact us. You can reach Blaze, Mike, Steve, or myself at the KSU website. You can download this webinar, and we have a companion text. You can request a review of your draft application by tab. You need to give them about a 1 week notice. And again, it says there if they receive it on or before the 7th, they can return it within several days. And you can also visit us at our website, ksutab.org.training. And I saw something flash from Alma again.
Oh, I
Hard-
just, someone was asking about, are they required to contact the regional contact for threshold? It's not required, but it's highly advised, because then, you know, pretend you're submitting your paperwork for the threshold portion of that application and submit it. And then we ask for that review, and then we can cross-check that. There were some that last year that failed, and if they had just done that, some of them just require some tweaking. It wasn't like there was like an applicant that wasn't eligible to apply. There were some little nuances of things. So just check on that, and that way you won't miss it for something, you know, we all make mistakes, right?
Yep. Right.
It's like a cross check.
So this isn't secret. Don't keep secrets, and don't be a silent sufferer. Let everybody who wants to help you. And there's so many of us who want to help you. So use us as best you can.
Be fearless in your questions. That's what I always tell my Region 7 applicants. It's that question that everybody's afraid. Oh, I'm afraid to ask it because I might look stupid. Look stupid, okay? It's worth it for $500,000 to help your people. Yeah. And these guys here, they know it. I mean, they have known this stuff before I even joined job training, and they have such a wealth of experience. So please utilize them. We worked so hard. We fought, several regions of us fought to get these guys here. And here you are. We've married the tab, and we've married what used to be HMTRI into one, and they're all united here to help you. So use them.
Thanks, Alma. So do you want to, so we have a number of questions for those who want to stay on whenever.
Okay, and I have one last slide. My wife is an attorney, so she and her friends would beat me up if we didn't show the next slide. Okay, so we can leave this up and start addressing some questions.
I was going to suggest too that, Nolan, if you don't mind, maybe you go back to that evaluation slide that shows the QR code while we're doing the questions, just so folks can scan that and answer those questions while we're thinking about it. But there's probably, I'll say there's about 10 questions we could continue talking about as long as there's someone on to listen. So
okay, so my question to the other presenters is, do we want to continue recording, or do we stop recording because we're past our time?
All right, for the questions part, yeah.
We could.
So I guess we can stop our
yeah, I think our plan.
We'll,
yeah, that was our
Tim,
plan.
can you stop it, Tim?